The arteries of the neck. Hi there. Look around you. You are now standing inside the warehouse of a huge blood manufacturing company called the heart. The production here never stops. Like a well oiled machine, it functions day in and day out, churning out blood. For such a huge factory to run efficiently, it also has to have a good delivery and pickup system. The delivery system carries the produced blood to its customers, while the pickup crew brings the rejects back to the factory, much like the replacements or exchange systems that companies offer. The blood filled cargo leaves the factory through the ascending aorta, from which three separate delivery channels take over. These are the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. However, on the right side, eventually, the brachiocephalic trunk also hands over its cargo to the two branches called the right subclavian and right common carotid. The two subclavian delivery lines arch over the lungs of each side respectively and head south to supply the areas of the upper limb. Therefore, the arteries that eventually run up north towards the neck and then the head are the left and right common carotid arteries. In fact, the carotid arteries are like the express delivery service, zooming straight to your headquarters, your brain. This is just like the super speedy drone deliveries. These tiny arteries make sure the most important packages, like oxygen and nutrients, get to the brain in the blink of an eye, without which the brain's function would come to a halt. Now, even though the subclavian artery makes a brief appearance in the neck, it is not considered to be one of the arteries of the neck. Therefore, we will discuss it when we discuss the area it delivers blood to, namely the upper limb. The head and neck have some key arteries that play a vital role. These are the right and left common carotid arteries. Each of these common carotid arteries splits into two branches, an external carotid artery and an internal carotid artery. The common carotid artery, the external carotid artery, and the internal carotid artery team up and form what we call the carotid system of arteries, like the main delivery system of that area. Now let's talk about where these arteries begin their journey. The right common carotid artery sets off from the bifurcation of the brachiocephalic trunk, also known as the innominate artery. On the other hand, the left common carotid artery takes a slightly different route. It starts its journey in the thorax, specifically from the superior mediastinum, right from the arch of the aorta. It's as if the left side has a direct business deal with the factory, while the right side delivery line is an outsourced project. However, as both the right and left common carotid arteries venture into the neck, they follow a similar path. The final destination is the upper border of the lamina of the thyroid cartilage, right opposite the disc between the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, where they split into two branches, the internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. The internal carotid artery is considered a continuation of the common carotid artery. Now, why do we call them internal and external? Well, it's because the internal carotid artery takes care of structures inside the skull, while the external carotid artery is all about supplying structures outside the skull, mainly the neck and face. Let us learn about the external carotid artery. This artery is like a supplier for structures that are outside the head and in front of the neck. It starts from the upper border of the lamina of the thyroid cartilage. It continues its journey behind the neck of the mandible, where it says its final goodbyes by splitting into two important branches, the superficial temporal artery and the maxillary artery. It's like completing a mission and handing over the parcel to the next one. Now, The external carotid artery is very efficient. It delivers not one, not two, but 8 branches. To remember these branches, think of the word external. It has 8 letters, and each letter corresponds to one of the branches of the external carotid artery. Let's name and learn about each one. The ascending pharyngeal artery is a relatively thin artery that originates from the medial side of the external carotid artery, close to its lower end. It follows a vertical course, moving upward between the side wall of the pharynx and the internal carotid artery, reaching up to the base of the skull. The artery gives rise to the pharyngeal branches that provide blood supply to the wall of the pharynx, the tonsil, the auditory tubes, and the palate. Meningeal branches emerge from this artery and travel through openings in the base of the skull to supply the dura mater, the inferior tympanic branch that supplies the medial wall of the tympanic cavity, a part of the ear. The superior thyroid artery arises from the front of the external carotid artery, just below the tip of the greater cornu of the hyoid bone. It moves downwards and forwards and stays close to the external laryngeal nerve. This artery is on a mission to reach the upper pole of the thyroid gland, providing it with the nourishment it needs. The superior thyroid artery gives off numerous branches. First up, we have the infrahyoid branch. It passed below the hyoid bone to meet the artery on the opposite side. Picture this branch as a pathway that allows communication between both sides of your body. Next, we have the sternocleidomastoid branch that supplies the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Superior laryngeal artery is like a companion to the internal laryngeal nerve. It's the superior laryngeal artery. This artery makes its way beneath the thyrohyoid muscle and then pierces the thyrohyoid membrane along with the nerve to supply the larynx. The cricothyroid branch takes a specific route across the cricothyroid ligament, like a delivery boy crossing a bridge. On the other side of the bridge, he meets his counterpart. Glandular branches are like the delivery boys for the thyroid gland. There are usually 2 of them. Moving on to the next branch of the external carotid artery, let's meet the lingual artery. It also arises from the anterior aspect to supply blood to the tongue. Sometimes it can even arise together with the facial artery, forming a linguofacial trunk. The first part of this artery lies in the carotid triangle. The second part can be seen below the hyoglossus muscle, and the third part on either side of the frenulum linguae. At the tip of the tongue, the artery meets its partner from the other side. The lingual artery gives off branches: the suprahyoid artery, dorsal lingual arteries, deep lingual arteries, and sublingual artery. The next branch is the facial artery, which arises within the carotid triangle from the anterior aspect of the external carotid artery, just above the tip of the hyoid bone. The entire course of the facial artery can be divided into a cervical part and a facial part, with numerous branches arising from both. In the face, the artery terminates at the angle of the eye, where it is called the angular artery. The artery can easily be identified during its course because of its tortuous appearance. This feature prevents damage to the artery during movements of the jaw, as well as expansion of the pharynx during deglutition. We will study the facial artery in detail in sessions that cover the blood supply of the face. The next branch is the occipital artery, which also arises in the carotid triangle from the posterior aspect of the external carotid artery. It runs upwards under the posterior belly of the digastric, deep to the sternocleidomastoid, and then lodges in a groove behind the mastoid bone. It finally pierces the trapezius muscle, and enters the scalp. Let us move on to the next branch, the posterior auricular artery. It originates from the external carotid artery, specifically from a point slightly above the occipital artery. It takes a path that crosses over the stylohyoid muscle in a superficial manner. Moving upwards and backward, it follows a course parallel to the occipital artery, running along the upper edge of the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. As it continues its trajectory, it passes deep within the parotid gland. Eventually, it becomes more visible and rests on the base of the mastoid process located behind the ear. This is the area it provides blood to. It also gives off important branches in the area. The stylomastoid branch enters the stylomastoid foramen. The auricular branch of the artery takes care of both the cranial and lateral surfaces of the auricle, which is the outer part of the ear. And another branch known as the occipital branch is responsible for supplying the scalp, located above and behind the auricle. Next, we have the two terminal branches, the superficial temporal and the maxillary arteries. The superficial temporal artery is the smaller terminal branch of the external carotid artery. It is smaller, but has a more direct path. It originates behind the neck of the mandible, deep within the upper part of the parotid gland. Its trajectory is a vertical upward one, and it crosses over the root of the zygoma, which is the bony arch on the side of the skull. You can actually feel its pulsation in front of the tragus, a part of the external ear. Approximately 5 cm above the zygoma, the superficial temporal artery splits into anterior and posterior branches. These branches are responsible for supplying blood to the temple and the scalp. Let us talk about its branches. The transverse facial branch moves forward across the masseter muscle, situated below the zygomatic arch. The anterior auricular branch supplies the lateral surface of the auricle as well as the external auditory meatus. The zygomatico-orbital branch travels forward along the upper border of the zygomatic arch, positioned between two layers of the temporal fascia. The middle temporal branch goes deep to the temporalis muscle and supplies both the muscle itself and the fascia surrounding it. The anterior or frontal branch is one of the terminal branches, and it provides blood to the muscles and skin of the frontal region. The posterior or parietal branch, on the other hand, supplies the skin and auricular muscles. The maxillary artery is the larger of the two terminal branches, stemming from the external carotid artery. It arises within the parotid gland, behind the neck of the mandible. The course of the artery is divided into 3 parts by the lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle, and each part gives off a significant number of branches. We will study the maxillary artery in detail in another session. And now we proceed to the next terminal branch of the common carotid artery, the internal carotid artery. This artery is incredibly important as it's the principal supplier of blood to both the brain and the eye. The journey of the internal carotid artery begins at the upper border of the thyroid cartilage's lamina. This starting point is at the level of the disc between the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae, C3 and C4. From there, it ascends upwards, reaching the base of the skull. It enters the carotid canal, located in the petrous part of the temporal bone. Emerging into the cranial cavity, it passes through the upper part of the foramen lacerum, a bony opening inside the cranial cavity. The artery finds its way into the cavernous sinus and follows a winding path until it divides into the anterior and middle cerebral arteries, just below the anterior perforated substance of the brain. To make things easier, We can divide the course of the internal carotid artery into four parts: the cervical part, the petrous part, the cavernous part, and the cerebral part. In this session, we will only discuss the cervical part of the internal carotid artery. The cervical part extends vertically upwards to the base of the skull. Along its path, it rests against the front of the transverse process of the upper cervical vertebrae. In the neck region, the internal carotid artery is enclosed within the carotid sheath, keeping it company with the internal jugular vein and the vagus nerve. The lower portion of this artery can be seen on the surface and is found in the carotid triangle. The upper part is deeper, lying beneath the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. Towards its upper end, the internal jugular vein lies behind the internal carotid artery. This is also the location where the last four cranial nerves, the glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal nerves reside, tucked between the internal jugular vein and the internal carotid artery. Interestingly, in the neck, the internal carotid artery doesn't give off any branches. Now let us move on to understand how the three carotid arteries are clinically significant. Carotid artery stenosis occurs when the carotid arteries become narrow due to the buildup of plaque or fatty deposits on the artery walls. This narrowing can reduce blood flow to the brain, increasing the risk of a stroke. Carotid artery dissection is a condition that happens when a tear occurs in the layers of the carotid artery wall. Blood can flow into the layers, causing the artery to bulge or become blocked. Dissections can lead to strokes or other neurological symptoms and may require medical intervention to prevent complications. Transient ischemic attack, sometimes called a mini stroke, is a temporary disruption of blood flow to the brain. It's often caused by a small blood clot that can temporarily block a carotid artery. Although TIAs don't cause lasting damage, they are warning signs that something's not right and can lead to a full-blown stroke if not addressed. Carotid body tumors are rare tumors that develop at a small cluster of cells called the carotid body, which is near the carotid arteries. While most of these tumors are non-cancerous, they can cause symptoms like difficulty swallowing and voice changes, and sometimes affect blood flow in the area. Carotid artery aneurysm is a weak, bulging spot in the wall of the artery. It could potentially rupture, leading to serious bleeding and stroke. However, carotid artery aneurysms are relatively uncommon. This brings us to the end of another session. We hope you had fun learning with us.